So we're continuing with part 3 of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on trial. And so we finished part 1, part 2, and here's part 3. And there's probably a part 4. So at the end of part 2, we were talking about the difference between heaven in Islam and heaven, let's just leave it at that for the moment. So the prosecution is speaking. So Palestinian defender, have I correctly stated that Muhammad's heaven is physical, not spiritual, like Jesus' heaven? The Palestinian defender, that's true. Since you mentioned Muslim martyrs, I'd like to specify that only martyrs go to heaven immediately upon death. As for non-martyrs, after they die, they wait in their tomb until Judgment Day, at which time Allah decides who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. That can be a long wait. The prosecution, a long wait indeed. Now let's proceed to Leviticus 20 in the Old Testament, where God told Moses, quote, "If a man lies with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination and shall be put to death. If a man takes a wife and her mother also, that is a depravity, and they shall all three be burned to death. Any person who is a medium or wizard shall be stoned to death." End quote. Here we see the biblical origins of the institutionalization and validation of anti-homosexual laws, as well as of anti-witches laws, and of anti-promiscuity laws involving spouses and parents. Now, in modern Israel, there are no anti-homosexual laws, while in most Islamic countries, the anti-homosexual laws are fierce. Israeli defender, why is it that today in Israel, homosexuality is not prosecuted, even though it is prohibited in the Old Testament? The Israeli defendant, in modern Israel, homosexuality is not illegal because attitudes have evolved, and consequently, there are exceptions to Moses' laws. The prosecution, so you admit that not all of God's rules need to be applied, that modern man has the right to discard any of God's rules which seem primitive and violate human rights. And that is the case with homosexuality, correct? The Israeli defendant, yes, there are exceptions due to changing mentalities, more modern mentalities. The prosecution, Palestinian defender, why is it that in Islamic countries there has been no evolution regarding the acceptability of homosexuality? The Palestinian defender, because there's been no change in attitudes regarding homosexuality, which remains considered immoral and against nature. Furthermore, the Quran must be rigorously followed. There is no room for Allah's rules to be modified by humans. The prosecution, so Islamic nations cannot modernize in any way which contradicts the Quran. Their rules and morality are frozen in time. Modernization is not possible when it goes against the Quran. The Palestinian defender, that is correct. Allah's rules are absolute and timeless. In the Quran, not even one word or one comma can be changed. The prosecution, has it ever occurred to Muslims that anti-homosexual sentiments and regulations are the result of deep-seated primordial fears that homosexuality threatened the survival of the human species by limiting births at a time when there were few humans on Earth and the risk of extinction was high, for example, due to famine and due to drought, whatever? The fact is that anti-homosexual sentiments are instinctual in our DNA from the earliest days of humanity. But those fears are completely misplaced today when there is no threat of extinction of the human species due to insufficient births. In fact, we have overpopulation today. In modern societies, for most people, logic has overcome deep-seated primordial instincts against homosexuality. Only religious people remain unthinkingly attached to the Bible's condemnation of homosexuality. Actually, many non-religious people are dominated by primitive instincts and are also against homosexuality. They are generally not well educated. Now, in the Old Testament's Deuteronomy 22, it is written that Moses told the Israelites, quote, "If the charge is true that the young woman's virginity was not found after she was given in marriage, then the elders shall bring the young woman out to the entrance of her father's house, and the men of her town shall stone her to death, because she committed a disgraceful act by prostituting herself. So shall you purge the evil from your midst." End quote. Here we have the institutionalization and validation of the idea that only women must be virgins until they marry, not also men. This is clearly a human rights violation, a discrimination on the basis of gender. Gender discrimination against women started in primitive patriarchal societies, but has lasted for millennia. And even to this day, women's equal rights are violated, whether by law or in practice, by many retrograde nations, particularly those dominated by religion. Even in the most advanced nations, women's equal rights are often violated in practice, though against the law, as many men have a bias against women's equal rights. Those are mostly men with inferiority complexes. Those men are also typically racist and feel threatened by minorities becoming more educated than them and more economically successful than them. Well-educated men are not racist, do not feel threatened by minorities, and do not feel threatened by strong, educated, successful women. Now, Palestinian defender, what do you think of Islamic society's requirement of women being covered, some to the point of being completely covered by burqas, of women not having the right to ask for divorce, of requiring women to obtain their father's or brother's or husband's permission to travel, of women not being allowed to drive a car, especially when not accompanied by a male family member? The Palestinian defender, the Quran, Allah's word, is more important than any laws made by humans. Humans cannot be on the same level as Allah or higher. In fact, excuse me. In fact, human laws which go against Allah's commands are null and void. They are blasphemous. The prosecution. Well, what about Allah stating in Surah 4-.34 that, quote, "The good women are therefore obedient. As to those on whose part you fear desertion, admonish them and beat them." End quote. That is a clear violation of women's rights. And are you suggesting that advocating for women's equal rights is blasphemous? The Palestinian defender. You are not a Muslim, therefore you can advocate for women's equal rights, but Muslims cannot. The prosecution. It is clear that any society discriminating against women will be much less successful economically, socially, and politically than societies respecting women's equal rights. The question for Palestinians will be, if they want to join the United Nations as a member, will they pledge to respect and enforce and defend the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and women's equal rights without reservations? Or will they put the Quran above the Universal Declaration? Will they force women to cover when they go to the beach or to swimming pools and go swimming when men are present? Will they segregate women from men? Will they force women to cover their heads? Will they keep women as second-class citizens under the thumb of men? Will they prevent women from going alone to discotheques where there are men? The question for Palestinians is, do they understand how much joy they are preventing in their own society? Do they understand that men are happier with women they respect? that relations between men and women, including sexual relations, are best when women have equal rights and are not dominated by men? How can Muslim men not feel strange and embarrassed when they travel to non-Islamic countries with their wives and have them covered while they, the husbands, are dressed in jeans, sports shirts, gold chains around their necks, and wearing Nikes? This moves me to ask the Israeli defender to comment on the practice by many Israelis to require women to wear wigs when men are not required to wear wigs. The Israeli defender: that is a religious practice not imposed by state laws. It is voluntary. Not all Jews follow that practice. In fact, only a minority of Jews follows that practice, the Orthodox Jews. The prosecution: since the goal of this trial is not just to help end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but to help the world become a much better world, the question of women's rights makes me think of the problem of animal rights. All over the world, many animals are mistreated, even by some American politicians. And laws against animal mistreatment are a rarity. When they do exist, they are not rigorously enforced. Why the widespread mistreatment of animals? Because in the Old Testament's Genesis 1:26, it is written that God said, quote, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth," end quote. Only when all humans are well educated will the mistreatment of animals end. The often shockingly immoral mistreatment of many animals, that many animals suffer, is the result of many humans not having empathy, not having a solid grasp of ethics and human rights. That is why all high schools should have 4-year courses in empathy and ethics, and a course in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, complemented by the world history of human rights violations. That will show that human rights violations have occurred in all sorts of countries. So it's not one particular people or nation, it's humanity in general has a very poor record of respecting human rights, and that has to change. A civilized world does not violate human rights. It's still the prosecution speaking. I'd like to switch back to the New Testament in Matthew 6, where it is written that Jesus said to his disciples, "Whenever you pray to God, do not be like the hypocrites who like to pray in the synagogues and on street corners and wherever else they can be seen by others. Instead, whenever you pray, go into your room and close the door and pray to God, your Father, in privacy. Do not pray with empty words and long phrases as the Gentiles do. And do not be ostentatious in showing others your devotion to God, as the hypocrites do. Your Father sees you when you pray in private to him, and that is what counts." End quote. I would like the Israeli defender to comment on these words of Jesus, even though Israelis do not believe in Jesus Christ and the New Testament. Do you agree with Jesus that believers should pray to God only in private, not in public? The Israeli defender: I do not. God in the Old Testament does not object to Jews going to synagogues and praying to him there. I do not think praying in the presence of others in a synagogue means one is a hypocrite, only wanting to be seen. It is important to be together with others having similar beliefs in God. It strengthens the community. It gives a feeling of security and of not being alone. The prosecution: but what you say implies that belief in God is not enough for persons to not feel alone and insecure. It implies that what they need is to be in the company of like-minded human beings, that belief in God is not enough. How can that be? The Israeli defender. It can be. We are humans, imperfect humans. The prosecution. I bring up Jesus also because there was a movement not long ago of Jews for Jesus, at least in the United States. People couldn't understand what was driving them. Do you know why they were for Jesus while remaining Jews? The Israeli defender. No, I'm not aware of that movement. It must have been a very small movement, perhaps only in a few localities outside of Israel. The prosecution. In fact, the Jews for Jesus movement was possibly only in New York City in the late 1970s and 1980s. Surprisingly, about 30 years after that movement started, the rabbi of the main synagogue in New York started a sermon talking about recently deceased congregants being together in heaven, adding that their family survivors would eventually join them to everybody's great joy. Of course, in the Old Testament, people simply die and are buried. They don't have life after death, not even Abraham or Moses. Jesus, of course, was a Jew. So maybe there is a little resistance among some Jews to believe in his message of eternal life. But do they realize that Jesus gives eternal life in heaven only to those who believe in him, Jesus? In other words, they must be Christian Jews or Christo-Jews. It seems that the desire for life after death is very strong for some Jews, no doubt deriving from the survival of the species instinct, which fights against death. The survival of the species instinct and the promise of an afterlife in heaven is probably the main reason that Jesus developed a following, which blossomed into Christianity, the second monotheistic religion, chronologically, while his reforms about banning money changers from synagogues and banning divorce are secondary, if not totally insignificant. So, Israeli defender, do you believe in life after death, or do you believe, as the Old Testament says, that humans simply die and are buried? That they do not go to heaven or hell, and that God only helps Jews here on earth when they fight against enemies, so long as they behave well, otherwise they are driven away from Israel in exile for generations. The Israeli defender. I admit that I find life after death in heaven, in the company of loved ones, is very appealing. The problem is believing that Jesus is God's Son, believing in the Immaculate Conception, believing in the resurrection after the crucifixion, believing in all those miracles which seem so improbable. The Palestinian defender. Muslims do not believe in life after death. Muslims do believe in life after death, in heaven and hell, because they believe in the New Testament, not just the Old Testament, both of which Muhammad embraces and which are the basis for Islam. As for praying in public in mosques, Muslims do not believe that is hypocritical at all. It strengthens Islamic society, it strengthens Muslims' faith, and they're following the teachings of Muhammad in the Quran, Muhammad being the final prophet of the God of the Bible, following the prophet Jesus. The prosecution. The Israeli defender mentions the difficulty in believing the various miracles contained in the New Testament. But are there not many miracles in the Old Testament which Jews have no trouble believing in? Like the Red Sea opening up for Moses and the Israelites to escape from Egypt. Like Sarah and Abraham having a child in their 90s, and God having conversations with humans, for example, with Adam and Eve, and even with the serpent, with Cain, with Noah, Abraham, and David. Like God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah for the evilness of their inhabitants, and Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt for disobeying God and looking back at burning Sodom. For some reason, God hasn't talked with humans for thousands of years. If that happened again, what a miracle that would be. Of course, Muslims have no problem believing in miracles. Islam is based on them. For example, how it came to be that the first mosque was built in Jerusalem, not in Mecca, and curiously, right on top of the ruins of the second Jewish temple, which was destroyed by the Romans around 80 AD, after the Israelites revolted against the Roman colonizers. Palestinian defender, how would you explain that the first mosque was built in Jerusalem, right on top of the ruins of the second Jewish temple, and not in Mecca, where Muhammad lived? What does Jerusalem have to do with it, since it's always been the capital of the Israelites, of the Jews? The Palestinian defender, well, Muhammad felt connected with the Bible. He doesn't deny that Jerusalem was the capital of the Jews, but the Jews were no longer there for over 6 centuries by the time Muhammad was born. In fact, the local population at that time was Palestinian, and they had the same heathen religion as all Arabs had until they converted to Islam. In any case, Muhammad felt he was the last and final prophet of the God of the Bible, and so he felt connected with Jerusalem, the capital of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The prosecution. I'd like to interject a historical detail, specifically that the name Palestinian was the Romanized or Latinized version of Philistine, the Arab name of the non-Jewish inhabitants in Gaza and other parts of the Roman Empire surrounding Jerusalem. The Palestinians to this day call themselves by their biblical name, the Philistines. The Romans found it more natural to call them Palestinians. After driving out the Jews from Jerusalem and all of Samaria and Judea, after the Jewish revolt of 80 AD, the Romans started calling the land of Israel the land of Palestine, since the remaining local population consisted entirely of Palestinians. Sorry for the interruption. Now, please explain why the first mosque was built on the ruins of the second Jewish temple. The Palestinian defender. Well, that's where Allah had Muhammad transported by the magical flying horse Al-Buraq one night from Muhammad's cave on a hill above Mecca. Muhammad dismounted Al-Buraq at the ruins of the second Jewish temple in Jerusalem and was brought up to heaven to meet Allah. After the meeting, Muhammad descended back down to the ruins to mount Al-Buraq for the flight back to his cave in Mecca. So that spot had a very special meaning for Muhammad. The prosecution. The question I'd have is, why didn't God make Muhammad ascend to heaven from the cave near Mecca instead of flying him to Jerusalem? That would have been much simpler. The Palestinian defender. Probably to emphasize to Muhammad that he was dealing with the God of the Bible and to have him connected with the capital of the Bible, Jerusalem. The prosecution. I'd like to add a detail. The street leading to the Wailing Wall, which is below the Temple Mount, the location of the first mosque, the one with the golden dome. That street to this day is named Al-Buraq Way in recognition of Muhammad's magical flight on Al-Buraq. I'd also suggest that having the first mosque built on top of the ruins of the second Jewish temple had a symbolic purpose to show the domination of Islam over the two religions of the Bible, and to message that Muhammad was indeed the last and final prophet, more important than Jesus, Abraham, and Moses. Muhammad being the founder of the new and final monotheistic religion, Islam, which incorporates the Old Testament and the New Testament in its holy book, the Quran. Another interesting detail is how Muhammad ended up creating the Quran. Palestinian defender, will you please explain that to the jury? The Palestinian defender. Yes, of course. While Muhammad was meditating in his cave above Mecca at night, Archangel Gabriel came down from heaven to whisper the Quran's verses in his ear. Muhammad memorized it all and recited it to his trusted followers, who then transcribed the verses into the holy book of Islam, the Quran. The prosecution. Now, that's a very interesting detail. Archangel Gabriel whispered the Quran's verses into Muhammad's ear. Archangel Gabriel is the same angel who announced to Mary and Joseph that they would have Jesus, born from Mary in the virgin birth. So Gabriel is another connection between the Quran and the Bible. The Palestinian defender. That's correct. I'd like to mention that the second mosque was built in Mecca and the third one in Medina. The prosecution. Please tell the jury how Muhammad discovered the Bible and got to know about the Jews and the Christians. The Palestinian defender. Muhammad led some caravans owned by his first wife, Khadijah, from Mecca to Israel. There was a lot of trade between those regions, and the caravans were important. Along the way, Muhammad would stop overnight in a couple of oases run by Christians and Jews. Over dinner around the campfire, Muhammad found out about their common God and their two religions. He was very taken by the fact that they had just one God, an all-powerful one, who would take a direct interest in individuals and tribes, helping them at times. That was in contrast to the pagan Arabs, who had many small gods or spirits, the jinns, who were not powerful and were never interested in individuals or tribes, even less to help them. Muhammad was also impressed by the fact that the Jews and Christians each had a holy book, which they could read and consult. That inspired him to create the Quran once he established his own religion, Islam, which means submission, submit to God. The prosecution. Thank you for that. Now please explain why Muhammad got very angry with the Jews and the Christians running the oases where he spent nights on his caravan trips. The Palestinian defender. Muhammad was so entranced by what he learned about the Bible, Judaism and Christianity, and the one all-powerful God, that he wanted to convert his own people, the Arabs, to the religion he founded, naming it Islam. As I said, it means submission. For legitimacy, he asked the Jewish and Christian leaders of the oases he visited whether they would endorse him as a new prophet of their own God. The prosecution. And that's when a big problem occurred? The Palestinian defender. Yes, because they refused to acknowledge and endorse Muhammad as a prophet of their God, telling him that God never spoke to him and that he learned about their God only because they explained their religions to him, answering all his questions. They thought Muhammad's request was preposterous, telling him that they didn't want to participate in a fraudulent claim, which, by the way, would undercut their own prophet's importance. That infuriated Muhammad. He felt insulted. He could never get over their refusal to back him as the last and final prophet of their God. The prosecution. So, what did he do? What did Muhammad do? The Palestinian defender. Muhammad ended up returning to those oases a few years later, once he had assembled an army. He had all the Christian and Jewish men slaughtered and enslaved their wives and children. In the Quran, he repeatedly justifies harsh treatment of infidels and defeating them in battle, adding that Allah not only wants Muslims to fight and torture infidels, but that He, Allah, will torture them for eternity in hell. The prosecution. Most people would say that's pretty shocking. Now, changing the subject, there's a little talked about book in the Old Testament which deserves attention, the book of Job. It's about Job. According to Job 1.1, quote, "That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil." Quote. It's also very much about God and one of his sons, Satan. Israeli defender, please read Job 1, 1.6-12 to the jury members. The Israeli Defender. Job 1.6 through 1.12 reads as follows, quote, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, 'Whence have you come?' Satan answered the Lord, 'From going to and fro on the earth, from walking up and down on it.' And the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?' Then Satan answered the Lord, 'Does Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not put a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth thy hand now, and touch all that he has, and he will curse thee to thy face.' And the Lord said to Satan, 'Behold, all that he has is in your power, Satan, only upon himself, and do not put forth your hand.' So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord." The prosecution. Good. Now I'll summarize the rest of the book of Job, where it is detailed how Satan progressively destroys Job's wealth and then ruins his health, all the while coming back to check in with God to hear his reaction after each new misfortune befalls Job. Job is shown resisting multiple losses without losing faith, but finally gives in to despair and starts cursing God for multiplying his misfortunes and suffering. There are some points to be made. First, that Satan is a son of God in good standing, who visits his father from time to time to inform him of his wanderings around earth while observing human behavior. He probably continues to do so. Also, Satan is not the devil overseeing hell and the torture of human beings. In fact, the book of Job is part of the Old Testament, where there was no heaven and no hell, no afterlife for humans. They simply died and were buried. Heaven, hell, and life after death were introduced to humans by Jesus in the New Testament. Second, that God had no qualms about making a bet with Satan on whether a loving, faithful believer would finally crack and start criticizing God for his multiplying and increasingly painful misfortunes. In other words, God treats his human believer, whom he calls his servant, with no empathy for the suffering he authorizes just to win a bet with Satan, just to test the limits of a human being's faith in the face of adversity. Is that not questionable? While we're at it, on the topic of hell, it is worth pointing out more than once that while many humans are excruciatingly tortured for eternity in hell by God, solely for punishment, in Guantanamo, Islamic terrorists were waterboarded by American intelligence officers, but not for punishment, only for obtaining information which could help avert future terrorist attacks. In other words, to save innocent lives. That's a very significant distinction. Modern morality repudiates torture as punishment, contrary to the morality of the New Testament and the Quran. One may find it questionable that God had Jesus tortured and crucified. What purpose did that serve? According to Christian dogma, to have Jesus suffer and thereby pay for the sins of humans. In other words, God validates using innocents as scapegoats for the sins of others. What type of morality is that? Or was the flagellation and crucifixion actually meant to turn Jesus into a dramatic martyr in order to increase his traction? Did Christianity really need the flagellation and the crucifixion of Jesus in order to become a major religion? One important point which needs to be made, even though it has nothing to do with the conflict and only involves Americans, is the following. All mentions of God in the Declaration of Independence and on dollar bills, "In God We Trust," refer to deism, nature's God, not to the God of the Bible. Most Americans ignore that distinction, believing that the God of the Bible is referred to in the Declaration of Independence. That would be incompatible with the Constitution's First Amendment provision against the government having or promoting a religion, whereby the government is prohibited from establishing a religion. Quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion," end quote. Therefore, American Christians who openly desire the United States to become a Christian republic do so in violation of our Constitution, in violation of one of the nation's basic principles from the time of its founding. Amazingly, actually scandalously, while he was Attorney General in the Trump administration, Bill Barr made a speech promoting that desire at Notre Dame University. Many wonder why that speech was widely ignored, his speech being very inappropriate for a member of the administration. It is simply un-American to want the United States to become a religious republic. The judge. Prosecution, you have once again digressed from the matter at hand in this trial. In any case, thank you, prosecution, and thank you, Israeli defender and Palestinian defender, for your advocacy. Now it's time for the jury to decide whether the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is illegal, in violation of international law, and specifically in violation of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which prohibits religious discrimination. If the verdict is guilty, then the court will have to determine the remedy. However, before the jury reaches its verdict, let's get the public audience's opinion. The members of the jury will first have to retire to the jury room and close the door so they do not hear the public audience's opinion. So, members of the jury, please go to the jury room and close the door. The members of the jury rise and retire to the jury room. The judge continues. Good. Now that the members of the jury are in the jury room, we'll hear the public audience's opinion. First, after I give the signal, all of those who believe the conflict is not really about land, but essentially about religious discrimination and therefore illegal, in violation of international law and human rights, they will raise their hand and yell yes. Afterwards, all those who believe the conflict is not illegal, that it is not in violation of international law and human rights, they will raise their hand and yell no. The judge gives the go-ahead for the public audience to vote their opinion on the legality of the conflict. Fine, thank you, public audience, for your vote. It seems the yeas and the nays are about equal or in favor of yea or nay, depending on the audience attending the specific performance of the play. Now we will have members of the jury return to the juror's box and hear their verdict. Bailiff, have the members of the jury return to the jury box. As soon as the jury members return to the jury box and are seated, the judge addresses them. Members of the jury, here are the instructions you must follow as you determine your verdict. The question to be decided is the following. Is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict essentially about religious discrimination deriving from the Old Testament and the Quran, and not essentially about land? If your answer is yes, then you must find the conflict guilty of violating international law as settled by the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proscribes religious discrimination. In case of a guilty verdict, the court will have to determine the remedy after hearing the opinions of the Israeli defender and the Palestinian defender, as well as of the jury and the public audience. Now, members of the jury, retire to the jury room and return to the jury box when you have reached your verdict. As soon as the members of the jury rise to leave for the jury room, the door at the back of the courtroom opens unexpectedly. An elegant elderly man strides into the middle of the courtroom and addresses the judge, the defenders, the jury, and the public audience. So, here ends part 3 of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on trial. And we will pick the moment up in part 4 when the jury members, as soon as the members of the jury rise to leave for the jury room, the door at the back of the courtroom opens unexpectedly. So at that point, we will start part 4. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you'll be interested to follow part 4.